Hi and welcome to the show. Over the course of this series, we're going to be traveling the length and breadth of Israel, checking out some of the most fascinating sites in this country. We're also going to be discovering a lot about the Jewish people's 4,000-year history on this land. And not only that, from time to time, we're going to be checking in with Rabbi Wein, one of the foremost historians and experts on Jewish history, and he's going to be giving us some fresh insights into Jewish history and this land, a land like no other. We're going to be kicking off our show in the hub of the country and, according to the Jews, the center of the world. Yeah, Jerusalem. This is the famous Yehuda Street, and this is a place that's filled with exciting stores, exciting restaurants, and some very interesting people. That's perhaps why this is the #2 most sought after destination point, and where we're going today is #1. That's right, the Old City. In many ways, Jerusalem is a city of extremes. It's home to the latest trends and fashions, and it's also the seat of our age-old culture. It's a bustling modern city with every first-world accoutrement, and at the same time, within a few minutes' walk, you could find yourself enwrapped in ancient history. You know, when you look around and you see how developed Israel is, it's hard to believe that the state is only about 55 years old. The existence of the state itself is actually quite miraculous when you think about it. #1, the fact that the Jews have survived through all these years of persecution, that the state of Israel was built up largely by a world Jewry that was still reeling from the Holocaust. And also considering that as soon as the state of Israel was born, it was nearly destroyed. When Israel declared independence in 1948, she was immediately attacked by 5 Arab countries. There was a fierce battle, and we ended up losing part of Jerusalem. This was especially painful for us, because for the first time in centuries, the Jews had been cut off from those places of Jerusalem that are most vital and central to Jewish life, namely the place where the temples once stood and the Western Wall. At the time of Jordanian rule, if any Jew dared step pretty much past this line in an attempt to go pray at the Western Wall, for instance, he would have been shot on sight. And so it was for the first 19 years of Israel's history. To make matters worse, in 1967, the Jordanians and Egyptians attempted to invade Israel in the hopes of wiping her out. Miraculously, the Israeli army managed to push them back in a war that lasted only 6 days. We won the war, and we won control of our beloved Old City. This was probably one of the most emotionally charged periods of Israel's history. Within a matter of weeks, practically every single Israeli has visited the wall. Even the most seasoned secular Israeli wept at the excitement of the moment. So the question is, what kind of history is there here in Jerusalem that can evoke so much emotion in the Jewish people even to this day? And what makes this place so special that it's sought after by every single major world religion? And more than that, did you know that Jerusalem has been conquered time and time and time again by some of the world's mightiest empires? What makes this place so special? Rabbi Wein?
Jerusalem is a special city. It's different than other cities in the world. Most major cities were located either as seaports or on rivers or where commercial roads crossed. And Jerusalem has none of those qualities. Jerusalem was always a spiritual center, a holy city. And that's why it has attracted so many different nations and been ruled by so many different people. Because commerce alone is certainly important. But as the Torah teaches us, you do not live by bread alone. And therefore, a spiritual center is also needed. Jerusalem always was the spiritual center of the world, and therefore many different nations, many different religions tried to conquer it, tried to maintain it, tried to make it its own. But Jerusalem has always remained the eternal capital of the Jewish people, in its heart and mind.
So, there you have it. And that's why Jews all over the world, no matter where they are, face Jerusalem when they pray. Because we understand that it was right here where the temple stood and will stand again, which means that this place, this spot on the planet, is the spiritual core of the world. As you know, this is the Western Wall, also known as the Kotel, and this is probably the most famous site in all of Israel. And for good reason. You see, this is one of the few things that is left from the Second Temple that was destroyed by the Romans over 2,000 years ago. Now, despite the fact that Jerusalem has been plundered time and time and time again, the Western Wall has always stood. And what's really interesting is that there's a Jewish midrash that was written over 2,000 years ago that said just that the Western Wall of the temple will never, ever be destroyed. So apart from the intense spirituality that a person can feel when they're standing here at the wall, the Kotel has also become a symbol of hope, resilience, and strength to Jews throughout the ages. And that right there is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. That area is known as the third holiest site to Muslims. And in case you're thinking that maybe the temples were built on Muslim holy soil, well, it's interesting to note that the second temple was destroyed about 540 years before the religion of Islam even began. Okay, back to the tour. This is Jaffa Gate, one of the many entrances to the old city, and perhaps a very special symbol of hope. Let me tell you an incredible story. These walls that you see behind here, these aren't the original walls that stood 2,500 years ago. Those were actually destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar and his Babylonian army on the 10th day of the Jewish month of Teves, 586 BCE. That's the 10th of Teves, 586. Now, I mentioned that date for a reason. Come look at this. Now, these walls that you see here were built by the Ottoman Emperor Suleiman the Magnificent about 460 years ago. Over the years, these walls fell into disrepair. That is until the Jews came back. When we came back, we started to rebuild and refurbish the walls. And you'll never guess what date the rebuilding was completed. Take a look at what this relief says. It says, Bayom Asara B'Tevet Eichet Shin Lamed, which means the 10th day of Teves, 1970. 2,556 years exactly to the day after these walls were destroyed, they're rebuilt and hugging Jerusalem's old city once again. I guess you could say this is what you call the magic and mystery of Jewish history. I mean, think about it. Over 2,500 years ago, one of the strongest, greatest civilizations, the Babylonians, the empire, the Babylonian Empire, they set out to destroy the Jewish people and the Jewish capital. Well, they killed thousands and thousands of Jews and carted the rest off into slavery. They also did destroy the Jewish capital. Now, anyone living at that time probably would have thought that the mighty Babylonians would have lived forever and ever, and that the little Jews, well, they would have just disappeared into the history books. And we see that that's not the case at all. Practically every empire that has set out to destroy the Jewish people, they're the ones in the history books. And the Jews, we're still here. It's quite incredible.
Just as you enter Jaffa Gate, to the left are two tombs. These are the tombs of the architects hired by Suleiman the Magnificent to plan and construct the walls of Jerusalem. But in the time-honored tradition of Middle Eastern contractors, they shortchanged him. They cut corners. The length of the wall was not quite what was measured, or what it was supposed to be. He didn't mess around with Suleiman. He had a very short temper and he had a very high gallows. And therefore he took the two architects and he hanged them. And then he buried them inside the walls that they had constructed, as a reminder to the population of what happens to people that try to shortchange Suleiman the Magnificent.
As you come into the old city, you'll find the historic Tower of David. Now it's interesting to note that in the Bible, in the Song of Songs, a lover speaks about his lover's neck as being reminiscent of the Tower of David. And in the Talmud, it actually records how King David minted some coins that had a picture of the Tower of David on the obverse. And right here behind me, what you see has actually got nothing to do with the Tower of David at all. I mean, I wish I could say that this is the Tower of David, but it's not. What you see behind me is actually built by King Herod about 2,000 years ago. So the question is, why did they call it the Tower of David? Well, probably because the Crusaders and the different civilizations that conquered this place, they wanted it to be the Tower of David. So they called it the Tower of David. And I guess the name stuck. The Jewish quarter in the old city houses fortresses thousands of years old, synagogue, hundreds of years old, and is probably one of the only archaeological tourist sites in the world that also has a modern middle-class neighborhood smack in the middle of it. The Jews in Jerusalem have a very long history. Mentioned in the canon of Jewish writings over 700 times, Jerusalem has been the focus of Jewish life for close to 4,000 years.
And Jews had by tradition known that this was the holy city, the holy place, the place that the Lord recommended that the Jewish people create a temple there. David himself is unable to build a temple, and his son Solomon, when he succeeds to the throne, becomes the builder of the temple. The city is captured by the Babylonians in about the 5th century before the Common Era. The temple is destroyed. The Jews are taken into exile. 70 years later, they return under the great scribe Ezra, and they begin to rebuild the city. However, that temple was destroyed in the year 70 by the Romans, by Titus, and the temple was leveled, and so was most of the city of Jerusalem. The Jews came back to Jerusalem, however, and in 135, Bar Kokhba's rebellion took place with the attempt to rebuild the temple on the Temple Mount. When it failed in 139, then the Romans, with their heavy hand, destroyed any hope of Jewish continuity in Jerusalem. They leveled the mountain of Moriah itself, and the only remnant that was left of the temple was the great western wall, which was a retaining wall built by Herod on the western side of the courtyard of the temple. This western wall became the holiest spot in Judaism simply because of the fact that it was our remnant of what once was the great temple. Over the ages, other nations and other faiths came to control the Temple Mount. In the 7th century, Omar came and built the Golden Mosque, which exists on the Temple Mount until today. The Muslims took it as being a place of worship for them. When the Crusaders came 4 centuries later, they took the mosque and converted it to a church. When the Emperor Saladin drove out the Crusaders and the country reverted back to Muslim rule, it became a mosque again. But the Jews never went away from the Western Wall, even though the Western Wall was subjected to all sorts of indignities. Garbage was piled there, people were stoned there. The Jewish connection to Jerusalem and to the Temple Mount remained under all circumstances.
In fact, if you look inside millions of Jewish homes, you'll notice a section of a wall that remains unplastered. This is to remind us that unless we've rebuilt Jerusalem to her former glory, our lives aren't quite complete. This kind of gives you a glimpse into how central Jerusalem is to the lives of the Jews. The Old City is inhabited by many unique and colorful cultures, and over the century, each of those cultures have settled in different distinct pockets or quarters of the Old City. Where we're standing right here is in the center of the Old City. It's not the geographical center, but rather the demographic center. And from here, we can actually get an overview and look at the various different quarters. So let's go take a look. This is the Armenian quarter. During World War I, Muslims in Turkey set out on a campaign of slaughter against Armenian Christians. They ended up slaughtering approximately 1 million of them. Many of those that survived fled, and many of them came here to Jerusalem to seek refuge. And many of their descendants live here to this very day. And this is the Christian quarter. This quarter is home to some of the most important Christian sites anywhere. In fact, no other place in the world would you find so many different Christian denominations represented in so small an area. And this here is the Muslim quarter, the largest quarter in the old city of Jerusalem. The Muslim quarter wasn't always the exclusive domain of Muslims. In fact, until recently, the quarter was a mixed Muslim and Jewish quarter. It was only during the anti-Semitic riots of the 1920s and 30s that the Jews of this neighborhood were forced to flee to the new city. And finally, we have the Jewish quarter. This is perhaps the most modern looking of all the quarters. The reason being, after the War of 48, when the Jewish quarter was occupied by the Jordanians, they systematically and maliciously destroyed most of the remaining Jewish homes, schools, and synagogues. Those lay in ruins until the Jews returned in 1967 to rebuild their city's broken heart. These are the ruins of one of the most prominent synagogues in all of Jerusalem. It was called the Hurva synagogue. It was actually destroyed by the Jordanians in the 48 war. When we came back, we immediately started to rebuild the synagogue to its former glory. But there was only one problem. We didn't know what kind of synagogue to make it. We couldn't agree how big it should be, how small it should be. And so instead, what we did is we built this archway right here as a memorial, and that's pretty much all that's been there for the last 30 or so years. There's another interesting synagogue we want to take a look at. It's actually right below us. About 700 years ago, one of the foremost Torah commentators came to Jerusalem with a mission. He was known as the Ramban, and he came to help rebuild the Jewish community that was all but wiped out by the Muslims and the Crusaders. This here is his shul. Central to the Ramban's plan was to rebuild the spiritual strength of his people, and part of that plan included building this shul.
In the famous letter that the Ramban wrote to his son, describing his arrival in Jerusalem, the Ramban said that he chose a building that had 2 magnificent columns and had a roof, a dome upon it, and that became his synagogue. The Ramban synagogue has undergone many changes. What is today the Ramban synagogue is located on the place where the Ramban synagogue was, but it's not the exact architectural building that stood at that time. However, as a remembrance to it, the 2 columns that the Ramban mentions are inside the synagogue structure. They form the support of the structure, and they're the outstanding landmark of the synagogue itself.
And this synagogue is still very, very, very much in use today, over 700 years later, both by the locals as well as by tourists.
You will notice that in the synagogue there are two arks, two cabinets that hold the Holy Scriptures, that hold the Torah. Why do you need two? A good question. There are many, many different theories regarding this matter. But since it's a matter that is only seen in Sephardic synagogues in the Mediterranean basin, in synagogues that were, so to speak, under Muslim control, the accepted theory is because the Muslims and many times forced the Jews to place a copy of the Quran in the cabinet in the ark that held the Holy Scripture, so that the Jews would acknowledge, so to speak, that the Quran was just as holy as the Torah. There's another theory that in one ark, the books of the prophets, and also the book of Esther and the book of Lamentations were stored there, and the books of the Torah were stored in the other ark. But it seems that the origin of it was because of coercion by the Muslims, and therefore that's how the Jews accommodated their masters.
So there's a law in Jerusalem that says anytime you want to build up, you first have to dig down. That's in case there are any archaeological remains underground. Well, it's just as well that law exists, because when they wanted to build the Yeshivat HaKotel, you'll never believe what they found. It was a subterranean gold mine. What they found were the remains of homes that belonged to Kohanim, the ancient Jewish priests who lived here in Jerusalem within a short distance from the temple where they worked each day. These ancient homes were uncovered only 24 years ago from the slumber they've enjoyed for close to 2,200 years. Among the ruins of these magnificent homes, they found ancient seals written in ancient Hebrew. And so too were vessels used for cooking, Ionic, Doric, and Corinthian columns, small perfume bottles, sundials, and beautiful tiny utensils made of animal bone. When Israel was attacked by the 5 Arab armies in 1948, among the fighting that was the most tragic and the most intense was right here in the Jewish quarter of the Old City. This square was the place where all the surviving Jewish residents of the Old City were gathered by the Jordanians. And a few hours later, all of the women and children were driven from the Old City, and the men were taken captive. As the Jews were leaving their ancestral homes, one can imagine that most of them probably felt the same depression that their exiled forefathers felt when they left Jerusalem in Babylonian chains 2,500 years prior. So the question is, how is it that the Jews in recent and ancient history have been able to face endless challenges with fearless optimism? That despite all the challenges, we've never given up our dreams of coming home. Rabbi Wein?
I think that any objective observer of history has to stand back in awe to see that Jerusalem is again a Jewish city. How did this happen? And the only answer that Jews have for it is that this is the beginning of the fulfillment of the prophecies of our great prophets, of the Torah itself, that there would come a time that the exile would begin to end, that Jews would return home, that Jerusalem would again be the center of Jewish life, that people would realize that the Lord's guiding hand in history is upon us, and that therefore Jerusalem, I think, in our time takes on even a greater significance than perhaps at any other time, because it is the vindication of Jewish history and it is the harbinger of the Jewish future.
So it was right here 2,000 years ago, as the Jews were being led away in Babylonian chains, that the prophet Zechariah wrote this prophecy. It says, "So said God, once again, elderly men and women with canes will dwell in the paths of Jerusalem. So too will the streets be filled with the playing of children." And here we are, despite the Romans, Babylonians, the Crusades, the Holocaust, and back-breaking odds, back in our homeland. Another Jewish prophecy fulfilled. I guess you can say this is the magic of our birthright. Bye.